Well, hello there, everybody. How are you doing today? Look at me. I'm in my beautiful character, Sophia, and she's got the really pretty armor, and that's all that cool stuff. Oh, man, let me tell you. Part of what I love about this game is that I can just kind of run around and poke things. I don't really have to do the story right away. I mean, the story's alright. I must personally admit that I am not like the biggest fan of all of Elden Ring's story, at least the stuff that I understand. A lot of it seems kind of grimdark, and I'm just over here going, poke. Well, that's more of a slash than a poke. That's a poke. Now let me tell you, kids, that's a poke. Anyway, today, I was just kind of thinking about, uh, my last video on the spirituality subject was about like boundaries and things like that, and now I was just kind of thinking about like the nature of tradition and things like that. I feel like humans get really, really comfortable in tradition and like get really comfortable in like when like ideas are shared by larger groups, like, oh man, if more people agree with me, that means it has to be correct. Even though that's like, if you really stop and think about it, complete and total nonsense. Huge groups of people can believe all kinds of crazy things, and it doesn't mean that it's any more true. There's a surprisingly large number of people who believe that the Earth is like flat, for instance. And let me tell you, when I flew in as a little cosmic eldritch kitty, I definitely saw that it was not flat. It was very round, like most of the spheres I visited. Although I have visited a couple that were like cubes and other weird shapes. But those were anomalies, and I'm pretty sure those were like, like elder things playing around and having their fun and all that. Ooh. The pokey stick is very satisfying for some reason to me. It's very, very satisfying to have the pokey stick. But yeah, no, I mean, people believe all sorts of crazy things, and a lot of people just seem to think that just because, like, a text or something is old, that it must be worth following. And I think the problem I have tended to find more than anything is that, like, there's a lot of, like, these things out there that people are like, oh, well, yeah, because it's old, it must be good. I mean, I think that for the most part, there's a lot of things with value, especially when we start talking about spirituality or spiritual thought, will transcend through time and not really be strictly bound by time. I want to give a good example of this. Adi Shankara. I like Adi Shankara for a lot of things that he said, and I think that he is, in many ways, a very wise figure. But I also think that the man, from what my reading, it would appear that he definitely supported the caste system, and he definitely supported just basically keeping like a Hindu society that was, for the most part, like warts and all, like just like not really a big advocate for changing society despite the massive amount of suffering that was going on in society and things like that. Now you could say, well, it's not Adi Shankara's job to tell us that we need to change society, and I can agree with that to a certain extent. But my question there would be, well, like, for someone who has gotten so far along the path and realizes, like, all this truth about non-dualism and all this other stuff, why would you still vouch for the caste system in any way? One would think that that would make you think, well, wait a minute, that means that everybody should be equal. Now, of course, you could argue that, well, maybe he didn't want to upset his donors or, like, the higher people in society because he was worried about that causing chaos. And that gets into one of those other very long arguments that you could get into. But my personal thought there is that, for me, I will take the arguments that I think make sense from Adi Shankara, and I will completely and totally ignore anything that I think is just nonsense. But a lot of people I meet, it's like, well, if he said one thing, he has to say that they're all good. Or if someone I agree with says something, I have to start agreeing with other things they say. It's like, I really don't think that's how that should work. Now, I mean, humans are a social species. I've observed this with my big kitty eyes the more I've been looking at it, right? And people tend to seem to love like grouping together into all these weird little bands, and like they start to have to like agree with each other, and everything turns into like a circle jerk where like everybody has to be like, ah yes, yes, we're so correct, ah yes, so correct, look at my spear tip, it spins the correctness juice. But you know, like I'll be honest with you, the more I've run around and dealt with people, I've found that even some of my favorite people who seem pretty intelligent will occasionally just be massive idiots. They will just occasionally, hey, oh, I don't, I thought I was gonna just be able to walk out of the way of that. I'm silly, but it's okay. But, you know, like people, people will run up to you, and like people form these little cliques where they all start agreeing with one another, and then everything has to make sense with them. But I have met so many people that will have like a good idea and then immediately follow it up with just the stupidest things you've ever heard, just strings of nonsense, utter depraved nonsense, depraved nonsense. But you know, like, and you know, the more I've read ancient texts and things like that, the more I find these kernels of absolute wisdom that are often followed by stuff that just seems silly and pointless. I've been reading about Zoroastrianism lately, and there's a lot of really good and interesting ideas in there. But obviously, I don't agree with all of them because I don't think. Part of that is just that I don't think that evil is like a thing that all comes from one source, in the sense that, like, I don't think that there's a separate evil entity. I think that a lot of things that we consider evil are basically just not really evil. They're just, you know, things doing their thing. Like, for instance, like invasive species and things like that. And an invasive species is not evil. It's not, like, that's just kind of the way stuff goes sometimes. And a lot of times that's also man's fault. I don't know. It's stuff like that. Like, there's a lot of little things like that that I could quibble with and go into. But there's a lot of very interesting stuff, but there's also a lot of stuff in there that I go, this just sounds like an ancient superstition. There's a lot of very interesting thoughts, and there's a lot of stuff that really gets me going, wow, that's really beautiful. There's a lot of really beautiful prayers in the Gathas. There's a lot of beautiful philosophy, but there's also stuff in there that's just like, this just sounds like some ancient tradition bullshit. This just sounds like something that somebody basically made up. And that's the same experience I get with people like Ramanuja and people like Adi Shankaracharya. Adi Shankaracharya, not Ada. You know, but that's basically what I've constantly encountered, is that the people are very rarely ever going to give you answers that are like 100% to your liking. And to me, I am just too independent of a kitty to be like, well, man in coat said X, so I have to believe X now. Like, that's just not how I work, you know? Like, I could sit here and really try to be like completely and totally down to clown with every single thing that, you know, people. Hey, you noticed me? Come here. Oh no, he's just gonna look at his friend. You killed my friend. Well, yeah, you guys seem to kill a lot more than that. It's a big pile of butt. There's no way that this castle had this many people. I just want you to look at the size of this pile here and just think about the amount of bodies you would actually need. This castle did not have that many people in it. I don't know where they got all of these. Unless some of this is also just dirt, and they were like, well, we need to make it a more impressive mound. But yeah. Look, they're having a little revolution over there, and I'm just here to stop it. I'm just here to poke some at it. Hey, man, I mean, I see that you got a revolution going, but what was your next plan? Well, we didn't have a next plan. Oh, that's unfortunate. I mean, it's sort of like, I think, for instance, you know, being a lefty, a little leftist cat, I also think that, like, for instance, Marx had a lot of things that sound fairly intelligent, but when I was going through his stuff in more depth, there were a few things that, well, there were a few things that I'm going to admit I probably just didn't understand. And I'm willing to be like, okay, I just don't 100% understand this dialectic thing he's going for right now. But there was also a lot of things in there that I was kind of like, this just kind of seems like it's not right. That was nowhere near me, bud. Oh, I thought that would stun him. But it did not. But, you know, like... That doesn't mean that you throw out everything Mark said, but I'm also just not the kind of person who's just like, well, because he said something, you have to agree with it. You know, like, that doesn't... That just don't float my boat. And I think the thing I've frequently encountered as I've gone through and met other people who talk about spirituality and religion and stuff like that is that, well, a lot of people put a lot of stock into the idea of if something is ancient, if something is old, it must be worth keeping, which I'm not going to say that for even a second. I don't think that's even remotely true. Did they forget that they were fighting there for a second? Oh, nice. Sorry to rain on your parade. Okay, I don't really need an extra bolt, thanks. I also realized that a lot of times when I record, I just always come back to this area. I like this area. I just like rain, man. Rain feels nice. I really like being out in the rain and things like that. But yeah, anyway. And that's kind of been my experience. My experience has been that as I go through a lot of these ancient traditions, there are occasionally teachers that I find that are really speak to me. And some things I find that I don't quite understand because I'm not from that time and I have to do more research. But I think that we should be much more cautious, especially if we're talking in, like, the spiritual dimension of things, about, like, just accepting... Hey, how you doing? Just accepting literally anything that's brought up because it's brought up by someone, like, old in the tradition. Like, look, Al-Ghazali can make some beautiful and legit points, but he also makes a bunch of points that are kind of just, like, something you would expect from a dude of the time. It's like, oh, yeah, that's, yeah. And there's also, like, a lot of things where times where just culture is going to infect, like, even, like, some of these really wise philosophers were just... They're just going to say things where it's like, well, okay, you also didn't have access to certain information, so it would make sense that maybe sometimes they'll say things... Oh, wait, what's this over here? Sometimes they'll say things that are just like... Oh, I don't really need that. Oh, man, that's real Dumbo material, my guy. That's real silly Billy type activities. I'm just saying that we need to think, like, critically about the sources we use and why we take them seriously. And honestly, to me, I don't take most people, like, even experts and things like that. Like, if it's an expert in a field that I don't understand at all and is completely anathema to me, then I'll just be like, okay, especially if it's not super important. But if it's an expert in something that I can at least understand and at least critically think about, and, like, especially if we're talking about experts in quote-unquote philosophy and things like that, like, I am completely and totally willing to consider someone who, just because they supposedly have some sort of expertise, wrong if they're fucking wrong. Like, I guess to me a lot of it just boils down to, we like to put authority into these ideas of, like, tradition and, like, oh, well, they had some sort of magical experience, so they have to be, you know, authorities on it. And in some cases, I can at least kind of get that, where, like, you're like, someone's, oh, a prophet, and you have to believe that the person is a prophet. Or you believe it because of your tradition or something like that, and you're like, well, that means that they have authority. I guess I kind of understand why you would think that way, but ultimately, to me, I don't even think that's really a great way to look at it. I think that most prophets of God, no matter how inspired they supposedly were... Hey, how you doing? Probably should have kept the shield up there, bud. Because my pokey stick is longer than yours. You know, like, it doesn't mean that every single thing they say is A, from God, and B, that it's all, like, accurate. I think that's like one of the most common assumptions I've dealt with is like,
I'm Edgar. So you can see how the menials, they gave me good service. Foul creatures. I'm sorry to but whatever you come here. Take this.
oh, thank you for the sacrificial twig.
Away you no reason to. Now then, away you no reason.
Oh, I guess I don't have the lady's letter. Excuse me. This is like one of those fantasy universes where no one believes in like safety railing or like the idea that you could possibly trip. But you know, like these constant ideas of like everything has to make sense because well the prophet said it. Therefore, it has to be true. And it's just like, I mean, prophets are leaders, but I usually tend to think that they're leaders for their time. And sometimes they're given information that really can speak to multiple generations afterwards. But there's also plenty of times when... Oh, wait, why did I go straight down there? Why don't I go... like to here? Excuse... Actually, I just want to see. Goonstun! Where, like, a lot of times you get these ideas that, like, oh, well, this is the final prophet, or this is the prophet that has all of the information. And it's like, then you just, like, I feel like every single time I've heard something like that and I've critically examined, like, what is being said, that almost never actually makes any sense, right? Like, it's almost always something where, like, okay, yeah, they seem to have some wisdom here, but a lot of this is just random nonsense. Or, like, you can really tell that they're a person of their time. They're not given some special insight into the nature of all reality in the universe. They're given information for their time. They're given spiritual information that should help them out. And you shouldn't look to them for, like, okay, you shouldn't look at them and be like, ah, yes, science. Like, especially if they're like an ancient person, you shouldn't look to them and be like, ah, yes, this person understood science better than like our modern day scientists. Like, sure, whatever, man. And I feel like a lot of traditions just kind of get used to not really being challenged about their assumptions. And then, like, the second someone is even like, you know, I don't really need to heal, but I'm going to do it just because. Oh no, they fade away. They get used to not being challenged about their assumptions, and then, like, they just start telling you, like, the craziest. I mean, okay. Like, as an example, one of the things I've seen on, I think it was, is it Meteor? Is that how you say it? One of the Arabic news networks was something about, like, women uh, need protection from men's eye radiation. I, I mean, there are certain things I've encountered that are just like so nonsensical that there isn't even really a good way to understand how one would ever come to that without having to believe like a whole series of nonsense ahead of time. But that's the thing about traditions as well, is that a lot of traditions can lead you to certain assumptions and behaviors and things like that because, well, they go unchallenged and then people start to develop these ideas. I mean, you know, I've studied quite a bit of Hinduism now, and there's some things that I just don't really think make as much sense once you get outside of the tradition as people within the tradition would probably hold to. And one has to ask what the purpose of pretty much any tradition you encounter actually is. Now, some of these are just going to be like your faith traditions where it's like, well, we do this and we've always done this and I'm not going to question it too much. And it's like, okay, that's perfectly reasonable in a way. If you're willing to say that you aren't questioning it because it's part of the faith tradition that you're within and you don't feel like it is your right or even like really your desire to, hey, how you doing? Yeah, I have thanks for appearing, my knight friend. Yeah, well. But like you see this kind of stuff all the time where people are just sort of running around being like, oh man, everything has to fit in a certain way. And I guess all I'm really saying is that there's a lot of knowledge and abilities in these ancient books and the things like the Gita and there's things like the Quran and there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom that can help you live your life. But please think about them critically and don't just accept every single thing they say because, you know, the magic man said that book is right. Like, that's. Yeah, don't do that, please. And of course, do whatever you want, really, because, I mean, if that's the way you've obtained peace in your life, if you think that the only way to obtain peace in your life is to have someone else tell you what to do, I mean, and to be fair, that does give you a lot of mental relief to just be like, okay, it relieves a certain neuroses to just be like, okay, well, the book knows what to do. I'll just follow the book. I will fully admit that I understand that, but I just think that we'd all be much better and much more spiritually advanced if we were willing to question and consider things rather than simply accept them because ancient book says words. But that's just my thoughts, my kitty cat thoughts. I hope you enjoyed listening to me, and I hope that you all have an absolutely wonderful day. And follow whatever tradition you want, just remember that it doesn't have to be the be all end all. Okay, bye bye.